Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss an academic report which shows that our media coverage was heavily focused on certain themes such as Reform UK and taxation, despite these not being the main issues that voters were interested in. So more evidence of a biased media working to influence an election. What could we expect to happen about it? And I would say that the media coverage this election was so far out of tune with public priorities. You don't need a university to conduct a study to find out. But of course, you do need studies so that you don't have to rely on perception. I said myself at several points during the campaign how genuinely shocked and appalled I was at the almost complete lack of press coverage of like the Lib Dems and the Greens and what seemed like the bare minimum even with the broadcast media. And you may say, well, Phil, that's how the media are. But actually, it was much worse this election. And this study backs it up, noting that the two big parties, they almost always get the main attention in the press, but that this year, the distribution of time for other parties was noticeably weaker in the broadcast media as well. I remarked on the fact that even The Guardian, The Guardian's not pro-Tory, and it's not pro-Labour really either. It has no shortage of commentators who will big up the Greens and the Lib Dems. But there was almost no news articles on either of those parties during the entire 6-week campaign. You wouldn't have expected any balance in the Tory client media, of course, but to not see any even in the small sliver of anti-Tory media we have just actually took me aback, because it wasn't like that at the last election or previous elections. This was like new. The headline summaries from this University of Loughborough report are, so taxation formed the major part of the general election media coverage. And it said with little attention paid to the NHS, housing, the environment and social care, all of which are more serious issues for the public. We know of those issues the NHS is considered the most important for voters. Polling consistently has shown for some time, ever since the Tories talked about, tax cuts, the public are going, no, we don't. No, leave the taxes. Can you invest in public services? That even included a large chunk of the 2019 Conservative vote, the levelling up that a lot of them voted for and didn't get, as well as more traditional Tory voters who weren't so bothered about the levelling up, but they do want to be able to see a doctor. The report also said that the SNP and Liberal Democrats saw a drop in media coverage compared to 2019. Now, when we consider that the Brexit Party were running in 2019, which is the forerunner to Reform UK, albeit not in seats the Conservatives won in 2017, you can't really justify the change in party allocation because, well, there's a new runner in the race, because there wasn't. It's the same party led by the same person in 2019. A cynic might argue that if we assume the media is largely run for and by the right-wing media, that they were happy to report more on the Lib Dems and SNP in 2019. The Lib Dems were running a disastrous campaign, and the SNP were going to be extremely useful in keeping Labour from winning seats in Scotland. The voting intention was rather different this year. Now, you may query, why promote Reform UK so heavily if the media are run by people who want the Conservatives to win? Well, Reform UK exists to make the Conservatives more extreme. The Conservatives were lost. Nothing the media could do was going to rescue them once Liz Truss had done her work and Rishi Sunak turned out to be a political ignoramus. So the fight became one of, how does the Tory party rebuild in opposition? Several media barons would love a trajectory whereby the Conservatives embrace the far right, wait for Labour to get complacent or for the public to just go off them, and then somehow attract the moderate right-wing votes as being better than letting Labour carry on in power for an excessive length of time. Now, whether this is what would actually happen is irrelevant. Do those who run the media believe that that could happen? Remember, Labour were in power for 13 years last time. They made huge improvements, even getting the NHS to be considered the #1 healthcare provider in the world. Yet in 2024, things are worse now than when they took over in 1997. Doesn't matter how long Labour are in government, the Tories can turn it all to shit again very quickly. And then make it even worse than they did in their previous stint. And I keep saying, it's quicker to destroy than it is to build. So I could see advantage in the media accepting that the Tories couldn't be saved anyway, switching their efforts to shaping the future direction of the party and been more than happy to use Reform UK as the hammer they used to panel beat the Conservative Party. The report did note that Reform UK got a lot more media exposure in this campaign than the Brexit Party did in 2019. This is because in 2019, the Brexit Party was actually just harmful to the Tories. Even though they didn't stand in pre-existing Conservative seats, they were taking way more votes from the Tories than Labour in those so-called red wall areas. And although that didn't stop the Tories capturing dozens of them, maybe due to the lower media presence, it still saved Labour, I think, a good 20 seats, including the likes of Yvette Cooper. So yeah, I mean, I've got a political bias, of course, clues in the name. And I look at the way the media have been representing different ideas and parties in this campaign with concern. I will be especially sensitive to right-wing bias. Of course I am. But when you also have academic studies presenting objective facts and figures, then, you know, you should sit up and take notice. The question is, what happens? Does anything happen? I think some things will happen. I think there's a lot should happen. And I'm not naive enough to suppose that we're going to get sweeping and quick reforms. The media, even the decent media, would resist any regulation. So if you go in too much too quickly, you're going to be accused of state suppression of the media. This would be unwise and in any case unnecessary. Labour have got time if they start early. Isolate the worst offenders to begin with. The low-hanging fruit is always the best place to start with any new government. The industry may react with trepidation, but I don't think they'll mind something that hamstrings their rivals if they don't feel personally threatened. And there are two very specific reasons for supposing that some changes will be coming. Essentially, let's think about the four types of media. So first, the press. Second, the BBC. Third, the rest of the broadcast media. And fourth, social media. Social media is the toughest. It's entirely privately owned outside the UK. And you need to strike a balance between bringing it to heel or the bits of it that, I mean, some social media is good. YouTube is actually one of the good ones. Twitter, other end of the scale. But bringing it to heel without risking the platform just being banned in the country, pissing off the public. But as Musk has decided to pick a fight with the EU over Twitter, I would say let that one play out first. When it comes to the press, the week leading up to the election became interesting. Now, we know that Keir Starmer personally fought against the press over the phone hacking scandal. As Director of Public Prosecutions, he tried to secure convictions against a lot of senior people in the media over the phone hacking scandal. There are concerns that some of them got off by lying in court, but we don't obviously have proof. Otherwise, they'd have been convicted and convicted of perjury. Now, he did get some convictions, but not really the big fish. Although he did take out Murdoch's News of the World in the process, but, you know, the big fish got away. So we know that Starmer has an issue with the excesses of the press. We also know that the Times editor met with Starmer ahead of the election to seek assurances that Labour would not look to carry out any press reforms in this coming Parliament. Starmer refused to give him that assurance, and so the Times refused to endorse Labour. Now, Starmer will have wanted that endorsement leading into an election with a strategy of winning a lot of seats by a small margin. To sacrifice that endorsement means surely he intends press reform. So you consider his background, you consider the fact he refused to rule out press reforms. It's not in the manifesto. So I think we can probably expect another Leveson type inquiry at some point, and it may not be in the first year because Labour are going to push ahead with the legislation that is in the manifesto first. But I think at some point we can expect it. Then there's the BBC. Now, the BBC is the low-hanging fruit. It's by far and away the easiest of the media to reform because senior appointments are under the direct control of the government. Labour could remove all of the key executives overnight and replace them. Now, I don't think they will do because, you know, for fear of looking like they're trying to control the media. But they have the power, and over time they will. And I'll just point out, the new Secretary of State who will be making these appointments is now Lisa Nandy. Now, she had some very clear views on BBC reform, and she wrote them down a few years ago, link in the description below. So the fact that Starmer appointed Nandy to the role is an indication that he is keen to let her do her work as well, which really just leaves the other broadcast media. Now, I treat these separately to the BBC because they are not, of course, state controlled. My view on broadcast media is They're not the top priority because they already have a regulatory framework. Yes, it needs modernising, but it does at least exist. But as GB News shows, what regulation exists is not being properly enforced. That is the major issue with broadcast media. GB News keep breaking the rules, receiving a fine, paying it, and that's it. And sometimes Ofcom have even let them off altogether. And I kid you not, they've used the argument, well, it's a smaller operator, so we shouldn't be as harsh with them. A channel that makes losses of 30 or 40 million pounds a year and still rumbles on isn't bothered about the odd fine. So before we even think of better regulation, which would only trigger a fight with the media anyway, we need to enforce the regulation that already exists. Because apart from anything else, most media operators will be happy with that because most of them already follow it. Ofcom must be made to enforce standards properly, no letting anyone off just because they're a smaller operator. And when they do find them in breach, fines aren't going to work. And they need to apply meaningful penalties. So Ofcom need greater powers. You know, none of these easily absorbed financial penalties. You know, because a fine for a wealthy organisation or person, we keep saying, isn't it? It's like license to break the law for a fee. You may even need, what about sin bins for presenters and editors responsible for the breaches? Breach, banned for a month. You're not allowed to, you know, that editor's not allowed to work for there, on garden leave for a month, and that presenter's not allowed to present if you fall foul of it. And the ban increases in length for repeated breaches until you're fully banned from broadcasting at all, or something that acts as a real deterrent at least. A bit like Labour's policy for water companies. So they're going to be targeting executives' bonuses and preparing criminal charges for repeated abusers. So you make the consequences personal to the individuals making the decision, not a small financial penalty to the organisation with deep pockets and seemingly no interest in a business model. But there are no signs that Labour will do this other than to note it's not in Labour's interest to allow GB News to take the piss. So it would make sense. But as I say, it also doesn't make strategic sense to try and do it all at once. I would say deal with the BBC first. The appointment of Nandy suggests that Labour are keen to do that, and it's the easiest thing to do. An inquiry into press regulation, again, that news we had leading up to the election of Starmer not giving the Times editor those assurances is an indication that that will probably come at some point as well, and that's fine. They can, although they've given no indication they'll do this, they could work on beefing up Ofcom's powers alongside this and then look at further reforms in the next Parliament if necessary. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.